8 people have been executed in Utah. Gary Mark Gilmore, January 17, 1977. Following the discontinuation of the death penalty moratorium, Gary Gilmore became the first man to be put to death in Utah. Gilmore, the second of Frank and Bessie Gilmore's 4 boys, was born in Waco, Texas on December 4, 1940. A de facto statewide prohibition on the death penalty that had existed for over 10 years came to an end with his execution. When Gilmore was younger, his father beat him regularly. Frank's mother denied his paternity and asserted that he was the illegitimate child of magician Harry Houdini. His father believed this, even if no one else did. After years of traveling, the family settled in Portland, Oregon in 1948. Gilmore began acting recklessly at an early age, despite being bright and gifted in the arts. When he was 14, he stole a car and was sent to McLaren Reform School for Boys in Woodburn, Oregon. A year later, he was set free and resumed his illicit activities. A larceny accusation kept him incarcerated at the Oregon State Correctional Institution from 1960 to 1961. After being pulled over in Vancouver, Washington in 1962 for driving while intoxicated and without a license, he was sentenced to time spent in Rocky Butte Jail in Portland. Gilmore was given a 15-year prison term in 1964 for assault and armed robbery. He committed an armed robbery in Portland after being released from Oregon State Penitentiary in 1972 to go back to school. Gilmore was a prisoner in Oregon who constantly caused problems for his guards. He was given the antipsychotic medication Prolixin to treat his condition, and in January 1975, they managed to arrange for his transfer to the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which at the time was a maximum security prison. Gilmore was granted parole by Marion on April 9, 1976, and was given to his Provo, Utah cousin Brenda Nickel. Nicole D'Amico offered Gilmore a position in her father's shoe repair company. Along with working for an insulation company, Gilmore also began dating Nicole Baker Barrett, who was 19 at the time. But Gilmore continued to drink excessively and engage in minor crimes. Barrett ended their relationship after they had dated for a while because she was afraid of his violent outbursts. Gilmore went on his deadly rampage not long after. On Monday, July 19, 1976, Max Jensen showed up for work as usual at the self-service gas station in Orem, Utah. Gilmore got into a fight with his girlfriend that night and took April, her younger, unstable sister, on a drive. At 10:30 p.m., he told April he had to make a phone call. He left her in the truck and turned away. Gilmore turned the corner and was out of her sight, entering the Sinclair gas station. He saw the attendant right away and understood there was nobody else in the area. He went over to Max Jensen and pointed the .22 Browning automatic at him. He instructed Jensen to empty his pockets completely, which the young Mormon did right away. Subsequently, he directed Jensen to go into the bathroom and lie on the ground with his arms folded beneath him. He was doing everything Gilmore told him. Gilmore raised the weapon to Jensen's head. "This one's for me," he whispered before firing. The rifle was then pressed right up against Jensen's head, and he pulled the trigger again, this time for Nicole. Gilmore spent the previous night in a motel with April, and then the next night he spent it at City Center Motel in Provo. The property was inhabited by the attendant Ben Bushnell, his wife, and their baby. Gilmore gave Ben an order to hand up the cash box and take a seat on the ground. Then he shot Bushnell with his gun. Then Bushnell's wife came in, and Gilmore grabbed the cash box and left. When Gilmore was attempting to dispose of the firearm in a nearby bush, he unintentionally shot himself in the hand. By Wednesday, Gilmore's cousin Brenda Nickel had turned him up to the authorities. Near a barricade, Gilmore gave up without a fight. He subsequently admitted to both murders, despite his initial denial. He was only charged with Bushnell's murder in that instance because of the exceptionally strong evidence. The trial began and lasted for only 3 days, barely 11 weeks after the murder. Despite Gilmore's best efforts to convince the jury that he committed the acts while mad, he was found guilty on October 7 and sentenced to death. He had not been a candidate for the death penalty until July 2nd, when the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the capital penalty nationwide. During the last 3 months of his life, Gilmore became well known thanks to the media and opponents of the death sentence. Gilmore baffled his supposed rescuers by publicly expressing his willingness to die, which caused them to doubt the legality of Utah's death penalty legislation. At this time, he attempted 2 pill suicides and went on a hunger strike. The execution date, which was originally set for November 15, 1976, was rescheduled twice. On December 13, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gilmore's mother's plea for a stay of execution, ruling that the death penalty may proceed. The night before his execution, Gilmore had been given a lot of drugs. When his family visited, he was joyful. He accepted his uncle's offer of whiskey and took a sip. Then one of his favorite musicians, Johnny Cash, called and sang a song for him. Gilmore tried singing along with him. Subsequently, he taped a message for Nicole, pleading with her to think of joining him in the afterlife as a favor. For 5 hours and 20 minutes, Gilmore thought his death had been postponed a third time. Through a live webcast of a news conference held at 2:20 a.m. by Warden Sam Smith, he became aware of the stay. Out of his 36 years, Gilmore had served 18 years in jail. Outraged at the judge, he erupted, urging the civil rights appellants once again to stay out of his life. The warden of Utah State Prison entered his chamber just 4 minutes before the scheduled time at 7:49 a.m. and informed him that the death punishment had to be carried out. He was strapped onto a black upholstered oak chair. Approximately 8 yards away, he stood before a canvas cubicle with 5 tiny slots and a weapon protruding from each one, with a white target over his heart and a black hood over his head. During a press conference inside the jail, Larry Schiller, one of the 4 official witnesses to Gilmore's execution, provided a detailed account of how the warden handed coffee cups while Gilmore was being prepared in the chair. 5 men started shooting. When the hunting rifles were shot at the white target over his heart, 1 man had the standard blank in his gun. The site, which is situated on a salt flat 20 miles south of Salt Lake City and surrounded by towering snow-capped mountains, was then shown to journalists. While they examined the bloodstains, the corpse was being transported by ambulance to the hospital so that the organs of the deceased man could be removed and transplanted as per his request. Gilmore chose to be put to death by firing squad, a unique method of execution that is illegal in most places. "Let's do it," his last words to the executioners, became a well-known quote. The number of executions did not increase right away after Gilmore's death. By the end of 1982, just 5 additional prisoners had been put to death, and 3 of them, including Gilmore, had willingly given up on their appeals. After Gilmore's execution, though, things accelerated, with 1,443 convicts executed in the U.S. in the first 40 years. Dale Selby Pierre, August 28, 1987. William D. Andrews, July 30, 1992. Just before the hi-fi shop closed on April 22, 1974, Dale Selby Pierre, William Andrews, Keith Roberts, and 3 other men drove there in 2 vans. Roberts and another man stayed with the cars, but 4 of the group burst into the shop brandishing guns. Stanley Walker, a 20-year-old employee, and Michelle Ansley, an 18-year-old employee, were held captive inside the store at the time. Pierre and Andrews led the 2 down the basement of the shop and restrained them. Then the group started robbing the shop. Later, Courtney Naisbitt, 16, who had stopped by the store earlier that day to express gratitude to Walker for letting him park his car there while he conducted an errand next door, was also kidnapped and held captive in the basement with Walker and Ansley. Stanley Walker's 43-year-old father, Orrin Walker, went to the store later that evening, concerned that his son had not come home. A while later, Carol Peterson Naisbitt, Courtney's mother, also showed up at the business searching for her son, who was running late for home. Carol Naisbitt and Orrin Walker were brought down to the basement and restrained. This increased the hostage count to 5 in total. Pierre ordered Andrews to retrieve something from their van, as there were now 5 hostages in the basement. Pierre filled a cup with drain cleaner bearing the Drano logo from a bottle that Andrews brought back in a brown paper bag. When Oren refused to give it to the other captives as Pierre had commanded, he was restrained, placed face down on the basement floor, and had his mouth gagged. The captives were then forced to drink the drano, which Pierre and Andrews said to them was vodka mixed with sleeping drugs, while they were propped up in sitting positions. The victims instantly developed lip blisters, burned tongues and throats, and had the skin surrounding their mouths peeled. Oren claimed that Ansley coughed less than the other victims, despite the fact that she was still pleading for her life and had to swallow the Drano. In an attempt to stop the captives' cries to absorb large amount of drain cleaner, Pierre and Andrews attempted to duct tape their mouths shut, but the glue was unable to adhere due to the leaking blisters. Oren was the last to receive the Drano, but after witnessing what was happening to the other captives, he opened his lips, let it spill, and imitated his son's fits and cries. Pierre shot Carol and Courtney Naisbitt in the back of the head, killing Carol but leaving Courtney alive because he was enraged that the deaths were happening too slowly, too loudly, and too messy. Pierre then took a direct shot at Oren Walker. After killing Stanley, he shot Oren once more, just missing the back of his head. After instructing Andrews to leave for half an hour, Pierre led Ansley to the far corner of the basement, where he brutally essayed her and made her take off her clothes at gunpoint. He then let her use the restroom while he watched, dragged her back to the other captives while she was still nude, put her on her face, and shot her in the back of the head. Her final words, according to Oren's testimony, were, "I am too young to die." When Pierre saw that Oren was still alive, he mounted the man, put a wire around his throat, and attempted to choke him. Andrews witnessed everything. Pierre and Andrews stuck a ballpoint pen inside his ear. Pierre pounded on it till it snapped, pierced his eardrum, and came out of his throat. After completing the process of packing the stolen audio equipment into their van, Pierre and Andrews left. Michelle Ansley worked at the hi-fi shop for just 1 week at the time of the murders. She was just 18 years old. She had recently gotten engaged, and her wedding was scheduled on August 5, 1974. Pierre shot and killed Ansley after essaying her. Courtney Naisbitt attended Ogden High School and was 16 years old. Despite surviving his wounds, he experienced amnesia, which prevented him from testifying during the trial. More than a year after the incident, Naisbitt was allowed to return to school, and in 1976 he graduated from high school with his class. However, the neurological damage he sustained from his head wound prompted him to leave college. He was forced to apply for Social Security help since he was unable to work. Catherine Hunter and Naisbitt married on November 15, 1985. He lived the remainder of his life in constant pain and passed away on June 4, 2002, at the age of 44. Courtney Naisbitt's mother, 52-year-old Carol Naisbitt, was a victim in the attack. Pierre shot her and she passed away in the hospital. Stanley Walker's father, 43-year-old Oren Walker, was also a victim. He testified against the attackers in trial after surviving the attack. At age 69, he passed away on February 13, 2000. 20-year-old Stanley Walker worked at the hi-fi shop. Pierre shot him to death. The bodies were found nearly 3 hours later when Oren's wife and other son went to the store in search of them. As Mrs. Walker phoned the Ogden police, Oren's son heard sounds coming from the basement and busted down the rear door. Carol Naisbitt was carried by ambulance to St. Benedict's Hospital, but she was declared dead upon arrival. Stanley Walker and Ansley had already passed away. Courtney was not expected to live, but he did, despite suffering serious and permanent brain damage. He spent 266 days in the hospital before being allowed to go home. Oren Walker survived with severe burns to his mouth, chin, and damage to his ear from the pen. In Farmington, in nearby Davis County, Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were on trial jointly for first-degree murder and robbery on October 15, 1974. On November 16 the same year, Roberts was found guilty only of robbery, but Pierre and Andrews were found guilty of all charges and received death sentences 4 days later. Roberts was paroled in 1987 after serving a 5-year-to-life sentence. Pierre was 21 years old at the time of the crime. Andrews was 19 years old at the time. Let's not forget, they were in the Air Force. Pierre, then 34 years old, was put to death by lethal injection on August 28, 1987, following his denial of mercy. Instead of having one last meal, Pierre chose to fast, pray, sing hymns, and study the Bible on his last day. His final words were, "Thank you, I'm just going to say my prayers." After spending 18 years on death row, Andrews, then 37 years old, was put to death by lethal injection on July 30th, 1992 at 1:30 in the morning. He had a banana split with his sister and niece for his final dinner. His last words were, "Thank those who tried so hard to keep me alive. I hope they continue to fight for equal justice after I'm gone. Tell my family goodbye and I love them." He was declared dead at 1:46 a.m. Roberts was 19 years old when the crime was committed. After serving nearly 13 years in prison, he was granted release on May 12, 1987. He then moved to Chandler, Oklahoma to live with his family. In 1989, it was revealed that he was employed by an electronics company in Oklahoma City. On August 8, 1992, he took his own life. It was barely a week after Andrews' execution. Arthur Gary Bishop, June 10, 1988. Following a standard police investigation, he admitted to killing 5 young boys between 1979 and 1983. Bishop was the oldest of 6 brothers when he was born in Hinckley, Utah. He grew up as an ardent follower of Latter-day Saints, an Eagle Scout, and an honor student. He was a missionary in the Philippines when he was 19 years old. Bishop was given a 5-year suspended sentence after being convicted for embezzlement in February 1978. However, he ignored his parole and fled to Salt Lake City, where he lived under the identity Roger Downs. His excommunication from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints occurred in 1979. He became a Big Brother to a 10-year-old boy for over a year after enrolling in the Big Brothers program while he was living in Salt Lake City. Directors found Bishop was assaulting other children, so they pulled him out of the program before he committed his first murder. On October 14, 1979, Bishop killed his first victim, Alonzo Daniels, who was just 4 years old. With the promise of free sweets, he enticed the kid from his apartment complex's patio to his own apartment. Bishop dragged Daniels to the bathroom, struck him in the head with a hammer, and drowned him in the bathtub after making an effort to essay him. He disfigured the boy's genitalia and essayed his lifeless body. He placed Daniels in a box, brought him outside, and walked past the boy's mother, who was yelling her son's name in a panic. He buried the body in Cedar Valley. Bishop said it was so stimulating, as he bought and killed puppies to relive the feeling in the months that followed. A puppy whines just like Alonzo did. I would get frustrated at the whining. I would hit them with hammers or drown them or strangle them. Bishop sent money and pricey toys to a young child named John, who was then assaulted. At a roller skating rink on November 8, 1980, Bishop was introduced to Kim Peterson, then 11 years old, by John. Bishop requested pictures of Peterson from John, and John consented to get in touch with Peterson under the guise of purchasing some roller skates that Peterson was attempting to sell. When Bishop and John called Peterson, Bishop asked to meet Peterson in a pool parlor. Bishop asked Peterson whether he would want to go rabbit hunting in Cedar Valley. Peterson agreed, and after snapping pictures inside the vehicle, they stepped outside and began to stroll. Bishop fired a .38 caliber handgun at Peterson from behind him, striking him in the back. He shot Peterson in the head twice more as he started to cry. In a moment of rage, Bishop disfigured Peterson's body, defiled it, and buried it next to Alonzo Daniels' remains. Although Bishop was frequently questioned by law officials, he was not thought to be a suspect in Peterson's disappearance. The man Peterson had spoken with at the roller rink was described by witnesses as being white, between the ages of 25 and 35, weighing around 200 pounds, and having dark hair. Bishop enticed 4-year-old Danny Davis from a grocery store to his house, which was half a block away, on October 20, 1981. When Davis finished playing with the toys at Bishop's house, he got bored and began to cry. Bishop covered the boy's mouth and nose with his hand out of concern about the noise and choked him. Bishop packed the body in a couple of garbage bags and put it in the kitchen corner since some other boys were coming over to his house. After breakfast the following morning, Bishop transported the body to Cedar Valley. The only child that Bishop did not abuse was Davis. A few customers remembered seeing a grinning man next to the child, but they were unable to provide specific details about his appearance. One of the largest searches in Salt Lake County history was undertaken by the police, who were unable to locate the boy despite teams of searchers combing through neighborhoods, divers excavating ponds and lakes, shoppers at the supermarket where Davis disappeared agreeing to go under hypnosis in order to reveal more information about the kidnapper, flyers advertising a $20,000 reward, and calls to the FBI. Bishop swore never to kill again after Danny Davis. But on June 22, 1983, a little over 2 years later, Bishop kidnapped 6-year-old Troy Ward as he was waiting for his mother to come home from the grocery carrying cake and ice cream. It was Troy's 6th birthday. Bishop brought Ward to his bungalow and asked if he wanted to play a game, now going by the nickname Roger Downs. When Ward said yes, Bishop took him down to his pants, shackled him, and tied him between two pillars in his basement. Bishop pounded Ward with a rubber mallet when he started crying. Bishop reasoned that it would be simpler to dispose of Ward's body in a trash bag and dump it into a stream in Big Cottonwood Canyon than to bury another corpse in the desert. 13-year-old Graham Cunningham, together with his father John Doe and friend Roger Downs, which was Arthur Bishop, were scheduled to travel to California 1 month later, on July 14, 1983. Bishop deceived Cunningham into returning to his house to get some Mary Jane to sell for money after picking him up. Cunningham agreed to pose for some pictures when Bishop asked if he would like to trade him a skateboard for it. Bishop struck Cunningham twice in the head with a hammer out of fear that he would reveal the truth. Taking Cunningham to the bathroom, he filled the tub to its full capacity and made him drown. He dealt with the body in the same manner as he had Ward's. Bishop and John Doe traveled to California 2 days later. After reviewing their earlier reports, the local police discovered that Bishop, or Roger Downs, knew the parents of the 5th child and resided close to 4 of the abduction sites. Under the guise of helping authorities with their investigation into Graham Cunningham's disappearance, police brought him in for questioning. Bishop told detectives he wanted to show them something at his residence because he was feeling pressured during the questioning. When they got there, they discovered 125 pictures of naked boys torn out of magazines and more than 300 pictures of young boys, some of which were stuffed into a white wedding album. Bishop added that although police were able to identify and speak with 21 of the youngsters he had photographed and assaulted, their estimate was low and that they should double or triple that number. Once they had Downs' true name at the station, the police were able to convince him to confess to all 5 killings. After less than an hour into the interrogation, Bishop took the police to Cedar Valley. The trial of Bishop began on February 27, 1984. He stated throughout his trial that his violent sexual fantasies were shaped by an addiction to child pornography, which ultimately led him to act them out. Bishop was found guilty on 5 charges of first-degree murder, 5 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of sexually abusing a minor. After a 3-week trial, he was given the death penalty. Bishop apologized to the families of his victims after being given his sentence and asked to be put to death by lethal injection. He sent a letter after being found guilty in which he describes his reason for committing the crimes. This is what he had to say. "I am a homosexual convicted of murder, and pornography was a determining factor in my downfall. Somehow, I became sexually attracted to young boys, and I would fantasize about them naked. Certain bookstores offered sex education, photographic, or art books, which occasionally contained pictures of nude boys. I purchased such books and used them to enhance my self-pleasing fantasies. Finding and procuring sexually arousing materials became an obsession. For me, seeing pornography was lighting a fuse on a stick of dynamite. I became stimulated and had to gratify my urges or explode. All boys became mere sexual objects. My conscience was desensitized and my sexual appetite entirely controlled my actions." On June 10, 1988, Bishop was put to death by lethal injection at Utah State Prison in Point of the Mountain. He turned down his last meal. He professed regret for his crimes once more before being put to death. His last words were, "I want to offer again my most profound and heartfelt apologies to my victims' families. I am truly sorry. I have tried my best to empathize with their grief and devastation, and I hope they come to know of my concerns and prayers for them." Bishop had 3 injections into his right arm, potassium chloride, Pavilon, and the muscle relaxant sodium pentothal. He was strapped to a gurney and seemed to stop breathing at 12:09 a.m., 1 minute after the injection started. Bishop was cool and collected, the most sorrowful and repentant and remorseful guy of the thousands of criminals he has seen in 33 years, according to Hubbard Gortz, a Mormon bishop who worked as a volunteer chaplain at the prison. John Albert Taylor, January 26, 1996. In the states of Florida and Utah, John Albert Taylor was found guilty of murder and essay, as well as burglary and carrying a concealed weapon. In June 1989, after 11-year-old Charla King was discovered dead from strangulation and essay in Washington Terrace, Utah, Taylor's own sister alerted authorities. His prints were discovered at the crime scene, which was the apartment building where he had been residing. Taylor was given a death sentence in December 1989 and put on Utah State Prison's death row. Albert and Ghislaine Taylor, who divorced when he was still a baby, welcomed John Albert Taylor into the world in Ogden, Utah. In his early years, he moved around a lot. At 9 years old, he relocated to Colorado after learning that his father had passed away. Taylor claims that he was abused as a child and started using drugs in his teens while growing up in Florida. He also claimed he had a bad relationship with both his mother and his stepfather, a veteran of the Vietnam War. He even stabbed his stepfather when he was 13. Court documents state that while he was in his teens, he essayed and molested his sister Lori on multiple occasions, as well as other young girls. He was also admitted to a sex offender treatment. Taylor went back to live with his grandma in Ogden in 1974, but he quickly left for Florida. Taylor was found in possession of a stolen gun in 1977, which led to his arrest in Florida and charges of burglary and carrying a concealed weapon. He was found guilty and kept behind bars until his parole release in December 1981. He was taken into custody in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in March 1982 on charges of sexual assault, armed robbery, and burglary. At the age of 17, he was labeled as a remorseless pedophile. September 1982 saw his acquittal on the allegations. Nonetheless, he was sentenced to 15 more years in jail for violating his parole. After being freed in 1989, Taylor traveled to Utah to live with his sisters and his biological father, who he later learned was still alive. Sharon King discovered her daughter Charla's body in the bedroom of her apartment in Washington Terrace, Utah, at approximately 3:20 p.m. on June 23, 1989. Charla had a nightgown wrapped over her head and her underwear shoved in her mouth. She was told to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation after phoning the police, and it was then that she realized Charla had been strangled to death with a telephone cord. Bertha Poster, Charla's foster grandmother, said that after going to the mall, she had dropped Charla off at the flat at around 1:30 p.m. The following day, Charla was supposed to celebrate turning 12 at an amusement park. According to the prosecution, Taylor entered the home with the intention of abusing the girl sexually. Prosecutors contended that after she discovered him inside the home, he followed her into the bedroom and put her panties in her mouth. After essaying her and covering her head with a nightgown, he strangled her to death. Lori Galley, Taylor's sister, gave Washington Terrace police officer Marcia Gatorcole information regarding the murder on June 25. Taylor's fingerprints were discovered on a phone in the King home, and they matched those on file from Fort Lauderdale police. He was taken into custody at around 9 o'clock on June 28 in Ogden, Utah, at the residence of Tressa Taylor, his half-sister and lover. The next morning, he was charged with first-degree burglary, first-degree child essay, and first-degree murder. 4 days prior to the murder, Taylor had moved to the same apartment complex to live with another sister. On June 28, Sharon King left the apartment building. She was angry because when her daughter screamed, the neighbors who stepped forward as witnesses did nothing to help her when they had the chance. Taylor gave up his right to a jury, and the trial was presided over by District Judge David Roth on November 27, 1989. In his own testimony, Taylor stated that he only broke into the apartment when no one was there and left his fingerprints on the phone after seeing cash under it. William Daines, the deputy attorney for Weber County, said that although Taylor had earlier denied being at the apartment, two witnesses confirmed him to be there when the crime was committed. Mike Gallegos, a prisoner, said that after a brief talk, Taylor admitted to him that he had accidentally killed the girl and had been masturbating on her body. The Weber State College Crime Laboratory, Duane Moyes and James Gaskill testified that the individual who used the knife to cut the telephone cord and wrapped it around the victim's neck was probably the same person who left fingerprints on the phone. The only pieces of evidence that linked Taylor to the crime scene were the prints, 3 of which matched fingers on Taylor's left hand. The flat contained no evidence of a break-in or the involvement of any other individual in the murder. Judge Roth convicted Taylor on December 5, 1989, of first-degree child essay and first-degree murder of Charla Nicole King. Leslie Beal, his half-sister, came from Florida to testify about Taylor's severe abuse at the hands of his stepfather and his 3 years in a sex offender program at a mental health facility in Florida. Taylor was sentenced to death row on December 19th by a Weber County judge. According to Roth, there are more relevant facts in this case than any mitigating factors. Till his death from heart failure on October 8, 1990, Taylor's father Albert attended the majority of his son's court appearances. Taylor claimed he was not allowed to go to his father's memorial service. Taylor chose to be executed by firing squad to make the process more difficult for Utah state officials. For his last meal, Taylor ordered a large ambassador pizza with thin crust, onions, mushrooms, hot peppers, sausage, pepperoni, ham, and extra cheese, and a Coke. With the help of former lawyer Ed Brass and Catholic priest Reyes Rodriguez, who performed the last rites, Taylor had his last pizza along with his uncle Gordon Lee on his final evening. Deputy Warden Wally Schulson offered Taylor more pizza, soda, and coffee, but Taylor declined, saying he had stomach pain earlier in the day. Instead, he asked for antacid medication. After 6 years, Taylor was allowed to have one last cigarette, and he turned down the option to be sedated prior to his execution. Each of the 5 police officers who volunteered to perform the execution received $300. The Winchester Model 94 rifles used by the gunmen were identical. Randomly choosing each firearm from a table, one jail official gave them to another prison official who was seated in a small room out of sight. After loading the gun, the second prison official would put it back on the table. There were 4 firearms with live rounds in them. One chosen at random was loaded with a wax bullet so that none of the officers would be certain that they fired a deadly shot. The non-lethal cartridge was tested to ensure that the report and recoil were difficult to distinguish from those of a real cartridge. The real event was allowed to be recorded by 9 media witnesses. The only member of the victim's family to show up as a witness was Charla King's uncle, Elliot King, who stated that he didn't feel sorry for Taylor. Taylor was led into the execution chamber just before midnight, where he was strapped to a chair 17 feet from the gunman and had his head covered by a hood. He was illuminated by several lights. He had sandbags positioned behind him to stop any ricochet. As he proceeded down the aisle, the captain tapped the shoulder of each shooter to make sure they were prepared. On January 26, 1996, at 12:03 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, all 5 shooters fired at the same time, causing Taylor's white fabric target to fly off his chest. His left hand wrapped into a fist and his chest rose. His head rolled back as his hold gradually relaxed. Taylor's neck was examined for a pulse, and his hood was verified twice to test for a pupillary light reflex. At 12:07 a.m., Taylor was pronounced dead, making him the 49th person to be put to death in Utah since 1852. His final words were, "I would like to say for my family and my friends, as the poem was written, Remember me, but let me go. Joseph Mitchell Parsons, October 15, 1999. Joseph Mitchell Yogi Parsons was put to death for killing Richard Lynn Ernest in August 1987. After hitching a ride with Ernest in California, Parsons fatally stabbed him at a secluded Utah rest stop. When Parsons was subsequently caught, he insisted that he was Ernest, taking on his identity. Parsons admitted to the murder and went by the nickname Rainbow Warrior. He claimed during the sentencing hearing that he killed Ernest to deter a homosexual advance, but he was unable to provide any proof for this claim in his defense. The jurors gave him a death sentence. Hank Galetka, the jail warden, received Parsons' final request to play basketball, take walks under the stars, and watch science fiction movies. Parsons also requested that his family receive his cremated remains. The requests were granted, although Parsons was not able to play basketball in the prison gym, only in a fenced-in leisure area. The fear held by the authorities was that an injury could have postponed the execution. Parsons was allowed to make his way outside to the execution site at night. He was with his brother and cousin, and he watched The Mummy the night before he was put to death. They ate Burger King hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, root beer, and chocolate chip ice cream together for his final meal. Parsons was allowed to give his sister and mother, Marie Gordon Rivera, a call. To ensure that neither party could be confident of who killed the prisoner, two individuals, whose identities were kept secret, were chosen to provide the individual injections. Of these, only one was lethal. Because the American Medical Association forbids licensed physicians from taking part in executions, the prison chose between paramedics and nurses. Parsons was given a small dosage of an intravenous sedative to help him relax before the lethal medications were given. At 12:10 a.m. on October 15, 1999, Parsons was executed by lethal injection. His last words were, "Love to my family and friends," and Woody, the Rainbow Warrior, rules. Thank you. Ronnie Lee Gardner, June 18, 2010. In 1985, Ronnie Lee Gardner was found guilty of killing a man during an effort to flee from a courthouse. The state of Utah executed Gardner by firing squad in 2010. After his case went through the legal system for almost 25 years, the Utah House of Representatives introduced legislation to reduce the amount of times capital cases may be appealed. Melvin John Otterstrom, 37, was slain by Gardner in October 1984 in Salt Lake City during a heist. In his attempted escape in April 1985, he shot and killed 36-year-old attorney Michael Burdell during a court hearing related to the homicide. Gardner was found guilty on 2 counts of murder. He was given the death penalty for the second murder charge and life in prison for the first. The event at the courthouse led to the state implementing stricter security protocols. Gardner was accused with a second capital offense in 1994 after stabbing a fellow prisoner while he was being incarcerated at Utah State Prison, but because the victim lived, the Utah Supreme Court dismissed that charge. Dan and Ruth Gardner had 7 children total when Ronnie Lee Gardner was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. When Ronnie was a toddler, Dan, a habitual drinker, left the family to start a new one. Dan and Ruth got divorced when Ronnie was 18 months old. Ronnie was discovered starving and walking the streets by himself in a diaper 6 months later. He was taken into custody when child welfare officials filed a failure to care petition. However, they subsequently gave him back to his mother. Gardner and his father had a turbulent relationship. Dan often shared with his son his belief that he was not his biological father. Gardner claims that after being essayed by his siblings, he was brought up by an older sister. Occasionally, he would flee with his sister Bonnie and take shelter in a hobo camp. Gardner got hooked on substances at the age of 10 and was given access to drink alcohol. He was placed in juvenile custody after he and his brother Randy were detained for stealing cowboy boots. Gardner remembered how his brother Randy had been taken home by his father Dan, leaving him alone. In 1968, Gardner's mother wed Bill Lucas, a man who had served time in prison in Wyoming. In the end, the Gardner-Lucas family had 9 kids. Gardner looked up to Lucas because he broke into houses by using his stepsons as spies. Gardner had been detained at several facilities by the time he was in his early teens, including Utah State Hospital in Provo, where he was committed against his will. Gardner said he had to fight to gain respect and to defend himself. Gardner was visited by Jack Statt, who was staying with Gardner's brother Randy when he was incarcerated at Utah State Industrial School in Ogden. Statt gave Randy $25 for oral sex when they met at a bus stop. Gardner remained with Statt after graduating from school in 1975. Statt was formally designated as Gardner and his brother's foster parent, despite social workers observing that the men in the home were dressed like women. Gardner claimed that Statt essayed them, and at the time, this seemed normal to him. In a psychological assessment, Gardner claimed that he was a prostitute while residing with Statt, who, according to psychologists, met the criteria for a pedophile. Gardner claimed that his most stable era of his life was while he was in foster care. In spite of the abuse he endured there, he still felt like Jack Statt was doing his best to help them, and he was a decent human being. Gardner's mother lived in an apartment building in Salt Lake City where he met Deborah Bischoff while he was still attending the industrial school. With Bischoff, Gardner had a daughter in May 1977 and a son in February 1980. However, the same month his son was born, Gardner was found guilty of robbery and sent to Utah State Prison. On April 19, 1981, Gardner managed to break out of the maximum security area of the jail and was shot in the neck while pursuing a man he thought had essayed Bishop. He was found to be the mastermind of a riot in February 1983, during which prisoners set fire to a cell block and blocked access to it. Gardner pretended to be unwell in order to escape from jail at the University of Utah Hospital on August 6, 1984. Don Leavitt, the transportation officer, was attacked by him, and he was made to unlock his cuffs. Gardner hit Leavitt so hard during the escape that wires were required to rebuild his face. With a revolver aimed at his back, Gardner coerced a medical student named Mike Lynch into taking him off the property on a motorcycle. A letter carrier discovered Leavitt's gun in a mailbox on August 11, along with a message from Gardner that said, "Here's the gun and wallet taken from the guard at the hospital. I don't want to hurt no one else. I just want to be free." On October 9, 1984, Gardner committed a heist at Salt Lake City's Cheers Tavern. He fatally shot Melvin John Otterstrom in the face while under the influence of cocaine. Craig Watson, Otterstrom's cousin, said the heist only brought them $100. Gardner pretended to be a childhood friend to attend Otterstrom's funeral. 3 weeks later, police captured Gardner at his cousin's house thanks to a tip. Although Gardner claimed that Otterstrom's resistance to the shooting led to the shooting, investigators were unable to locate any proof to back up this statement. Gardner was detained, and a bail of $1.5 million was set in place. Darcy Perry McCoy, who testified against him, was identified as his getaway driver. Gardner tried to flee from detention on April 2, 1985, during the Otterstrom murder trial, using a handgun that had been smuggled into the Metropolitan Hall of Justice in Salt Lake City. Jim Klain of the Salt Lake City Fire Department thought Gardner was given the revolver while he was being led from the subterranean parking lot into the courthouse. Ronnie pulled out the revolver, but guard Luther Hensley shot him in the right shoulder before he could fire. Gardner then struck George Kirk, the unarmed bailiff, in the abdomen. Gardner ran to the courtroom archives and approached Michael Burdell and Robert Macri, the attorneys. Macri claims that when Gardner leveled the rifle at him, he shifted his target to Burdell, who had been working pro bono for his church. Gardner shot him in the eye. He then ran from the building to find himself surrounded by numerous police officers. He tossed his revolver and lied down. After being transported to the University of Utah Health Services Center, Gardner made a full recovery despite being categorized as seriously ill. About 45 minutes later, Burdell passed away at Holy Cross Hospital during surgery. Kirk survived surgery, even though the LDS hospital believed he would not. A bag of men's clothes was discovered in the basement beneath a sink in the woman's lavatory during a search of the courthouse. Gardner's revolver, said to prosecutor Bob Stott, had been attached to a first-floor water fountain. About a mile away, Darcy Perry McCoy was discovered unarmed and taken into custody. For sending the clothing and notes before the attempted escape, Karma Jolie Hainsworth was given an 8-year prison sentence. However, at the time, it was unknown who had given Gardner the gun. Although Salt Lake County Sheriff Hayward stated that the prison guard who shot Gardner ought to have continued shooting until Gardner was dead, State Corrections Director William Vickery cleared the prison guard's behavior. Gardner had been shielding himself with a hostage. Sheriff Hayward stated that the escape attempt seemed well thought out and attributed the security lapse to the Metropolitan Hall of Justice design, which permitted free entry to sections where inmates were housed. Gardner was ultimately given a death sentence and chose the firing squad execution over lethal injection. In Utah, lawmakers banned the firing squad as a means of execution in 2004, but prisoners who were convicted before that time, like Gardner, were still able to choose that option. Gardner's death row imprisonment, at the time the youngest prisoner in Utah, was not without incidents. Gardner and other prisoners alleged unconstitutional confinement in filthy circumstances with inadequate food during a hearing on February 19, 1987. While other prisoners celebrated and blocked the doors, Gardner broke through a glass barrier in a prison visiting area on October 28, 1987, and had relations with a lady who was meeting him. Gardner said that it was an accident that the glass broke. Representative Dan Tuttle of Utah submitted the Ronnie Lee Gardner bill in 1993, allowing law enforcement to shoot prisoners who are trying to flee, regardless of whether they are armed or not. On September 25, 1994, Gardner used a shiv made out of sunglasses to stab prisoner Richard Fats Thomas after becoming inebriated from drinking alcohol that he had made in the sink of his own cell. Despite sustaining 9 potentially fatal puncture wounds to his face, lips, arm, and chest, Thomas fully recovered. On June 15, 2010, Gardner ate a last meal of steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up before beginning a 48-hour fast while watching the Lord of the Rings film trilogy and reading Divine Justice. Prior to his execution, Gardner had a visit from an LDS bishop and his relatives. He walked willingly to the execution chamber and he did not have any final words. Gardner was put to death by firing squad at Utah State Prison in Draper on June 18, 2010 at 12:15 a.m. He was strapped onto a black metal chair, his head covered by a hood. He was surrounded by sandbags to deflect ricochet. 5 experienced police officers, all of whom remained anonymous, made up the shooting squad. With a white target over Gardner's heart, the officers were positioned approximately 25 feet away from him. All of the firing squad's weapons were loaded with live rounds, with the exception of one that had a wax bullet. The squad used a countdown cadence beginning with 5 and simultaneously firing right before 2. It was hard to see the blood from his wounds because of his dark blue jumpsuit. His family and friends were just outside the prison. They did not witness his execution, per his request. His daughter was given permission to carry his cremated remains back to Idaho with his family. Tabron Dave Honey was also executed this year on August 8, 2024 by lethal injection. You can watch the video about people executed in August if you want to know his story. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.